There was one rule Japanese fighter pilots trusted more than almost anything else. If the fight became a turn, the Zero won. In 1942, that was not arrogance, it was experience. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero could carve a tighter circle than the American fighters meeting it over the Pacific. It could climb fast enough to punish a pilot who hesitated. It could fly so far that Allied crews often felt as if it had appeared from nowhere, escorted bombers across impossible distances, then stayed long enough to hunt anything that came up to challenge them. The P-40 could not match it in a turning fight. The P-39 could not, and the Grumman F4F Wildcat, the fighter American naval aviators carried into the first desperate months of the Pacific War, could not outturn a Zero under any honest condition. Japanese pilots knew it, American pilots knew it, and the sky kept proving it. A Zero pilot only needed to close, force the turn, slide inside the enemy's circle, and wait for the gun sight to settle. That was the doctrine. That was the habit. That was the trap. But the trap was not set by the Zero, it was set for it. At a kitchen table in the United States, a Navy squadron commander named John Thach stared at the problem with matchsticks in his hands. He was not trying to make the Wildcat more agile. He could not. He was not trying to pretend his pilots were going to win contests their aircraft had already lost on paper. He was asking a colder question. What if the fight never became the fight the Zero wanted? Thach had read the intelligence. The Zero's turning radius was not a rumor. Its climb was not a myth. Its advantage was real enough to kill men who tried to solve it with bravery alone. So he moved the matchsticks. 2 Wildcats, not 1. Separated by several hundred yards. Loose enough to create space. Close enough to protect each other. 1 enemy fighter committing from behind. And then, the threatened Wildcat would not turn away. It would turn toward its wingman. That single decision changed the geometry of the sky. The Zero pilot, locked onto the tail of the first fighter, would continue forward into the path of the second. If he stayed with the chase, he flew into American guns. If he broke away, the kill vanished. There was no magic in it, no new engine, no secret armor. Just 2 pilots refusing to be 2 separate targets. The maneuver would be called the Thach Weave. But before Japanese pilots had a name for it, they met it as a disturbance in the rules. And over Guadalcanal, one experienced Zero leader felt that disturbance arrived from the side. By the autumn of 1942, Tadashi Nakajima was not a novice wandering into his first dogfight. He was a combat-tested Japanese naval aviator with the Tainan Air Group, operating from Rabaul during the brutal fight for Guadalcanal. He knew the campaign mattered. Since the Marines had landed in August, Henderson Field had become more than an airstrip. It was a stake driven into Japan's southern advance. Every raid, every interception, every fighter sweep over that field was part of a larger struggle neither side could afford to lose. Nakajima also knew his aircraft. He knew what the Zero could do when a Wildcat accepted a turning fight. He had been trained in a world where individual skill and machine performance met directly in the circle. Get behind him, tighten the turn, stay inside, fire. That pattern had worked across the opening months of the war. So when American fighters rose near Guadalcanal, Nakajima had no reason to believe the basic law had changed. The Wildcats were rugged. Japanese pilots respected that. They could absorb punishment better than expected. They were not easy prey in the way careless men imagined, but agile, no. A Wildcat did not beat a Zero by dancing with it, so Nakajima selected his target. A single American fighter, a familiar shape, a familiar mistake waiting to happen. He closed the distance. He settled behind it. The first part of the attack worked exactly as it was supposed to work. That is what made the next moment so dangerous, because nothing warned him that the American pilot was not trying to escape alone. The Wildcat turned, but not in the way Nakajima expected. It did not try to outcircle the Zero. It did not panic into the losing contest. It angled toward another Wildcat flying hundreds of yards away. For a fraction of time, that may have looked like desperation. To a Zero pilot committed to the chase, it looked like a target making its final mistake. So Nakajima followed, and by following, he crossed the invisible line Thach had drawn with matchsticks. The second Wildcat came in from the side, not from where the turning doctrine had trained Nakajima to look, not from the goal he was winning, from the space the Americans had deliberately left open. There was suddenly an American gun sight where there should have been empty air. Nakajima could not keep the attack and survive it. He broke downward in a violent dive, giving up the kill, using speed, altitude, and instinct to tear himself away from a position he had not expected to enter. The Wildcat he had been pursuing lived, not because it had outturned him, not because its pilot had become better than the Zero in a contest of aircraft, It lived because the American pilot had trusted another man to arrive at the exact second the Zero's attention became most dangerous and most blind. According to the post-war account preserved by Saburo Sakai, Nakajima returned to Rabaul furious after an encounter with this strange American tactic. Sakai's memoir gives us a remembered pilot's view, not an official combat report, but the emotional truth inside it is hard to miss. An experienced Japanese fighter leader had attacked correctly. He had used the aircraft correctly. He had obeyed the doctrine correctly, and still the kill disappeared. That is the part that mattered. The Zero had not suddenly become weak. Its turning advantage was still real. Its climb was still frightening. Its range still made it one of the most remarkable fighter designs of the war. But the Americans had found a way to make those strengths less decisive. They had changed the question. Instead of asking, can a Wildcat beat a Zero in a turn? They asked, what happens when a Zero wins the turn against the wrong target? That question spread through the skies above the Solomon Islands. By late 1942, American naval and marine pilots were no longer treating the Thach Weave as one man's private trick. The idea had moved from Thach's kitchen table, to mock combat, to proof under fire at Midway, and then into the hard daily fighting around Guadalcanal. Pairs of Wildcats kept wider spacing. Wingmen watched each other with a seriousness that could decide who came home. A pilot being attacked had to resist every lonely instinct telling him to save himself by himself. He had to turn toward help. The other pilot had to be there when the moment arrived. The tactic demanded discipline, it demanded timing, it demanded trust under terror. And that made it especially dangerous to an opponent trained to believe the decisive contest was between one aircraft and another aircraft. Japanese pilots at Rabaul began encountering a pattern that felt wrong before it was fully understood. An American fighter that should have been trapped suddenly became bait. A pursuit that should have narrowed into a kill opened sideways into danger. A Zero pilot who had earned a firing position found himself forced to break off or pass in front of another Wildcat's guns. Sometimes numbers could overwhelm the Weave. If enough attackers crowded the formation, if the spacing broke, if communication failed, the Zero was still lethal. No tactic erased physics, and no maneuver turned Wildcats into miracles. But against properly paired American fighters, especially when the numbers were even or close to even, the Japanese advantage no longer converted as cleanly into kills. That was a bigger problem than one frustrated pilot. Japan's naval air arm had entered the Pacific War with extraordinary veterans. Many had fought over China. Many had trained for years in a system that produced elite pilots slowly and expensively. In the opening months, those men gave the Zero its terrifying reputation. But Guadalcanal was not a clean duel, it was attrition. Pilots were lost, aircraft were lost, experience was drained away day after day over water, jungle, carriers, and contested airfields. A tactic like the Thach Weave did not need to shoot down every Zero to matter. It only needed to change the exchange rate. A Wildcat that survived one more pass meant one more American pilot could fly again tomorrow. A Zero pilot forced to break instead of kill had spent fuel, altitude, and opportunity for nothing. A veteran lost in a confused engagement was not quickly replaced by Japan's training pipeline. The Americans were buying time with geometry. They were buying survival with teamwork. And in a campaign where survival itself became a weapon, that mattered. The deeper wound was psychological. Japanese doctrine had treated aircraft performance and individual mastery as the center of the fight. The Zero's design seemed to confirm that belief. It was light, long-legged, agile, and deadly in the hands of a trained pilot. The Wildcat was heavier, less graceful, less glamorous. It could not win the contest the Zero had been built to win, so the Americans stopped accepting that contest. That is why Nakajima's reaction matters more than one broken attack. His frustration shows the moment a pilot runs into a fact his training has not prepared him to process. He did not lose because he forgot how to fly. He did not lose because the Zero stopped turning. He lost the kill because the rules he had mastered no longer controlled the engagement. By 1943, the material balance began to change more visibly. The F4U Corsair reached Marine units in the Solomons. The F6F Hellcat entered carrier combat later that year. American pilots would soon fly machines that could challenge the Zero more directly in ways the Wildcat could not. But that later strength can hide the earlier achievement. Before the Hellcat made the air war look different, and before the Corsair became a legend in its own right, Wildcat pilots had already shown that the Zero could be survived. Not by pretending it was ordinary, not by denying its advantages, But by building a tactic around the exact moment, those advantages made a pilot commit too hard. The Thach Weave was not a better airplane. It was a better argument. It said that a fighter's greatest strength can become predictable if doctrine turns it into habit. It said that a pursuit creates blindness. It said that two disciplined men flying inferior machines can create a problem one superior machine cannot solve alone. John Thach would go on to a distinguished naval career and eventually become an admiral. The matchstick solution he built at his table would outlive the specific aircraft that inspired it. The principle behind it, mutual support defeating individual advantage, would remain valuable long after the Zero disappeared from frontline war. Tadashi Nakajima survived the war as well. His reported anger after meeting the Weave survives because Saburo Sakai recorded it, giving history a rare glimpse of tactical innovation from the side that first experienced it as confusion. That is why the story still holds. Because the Zero did not fail as an aircraft. It remained extraordinary. What failed was the belief that the fight would always happen on the Zero's terms. Over Guadalcanal, Nakajima did what his aircraft, his training, and his doctrine told him to do. He closed, he turned, he committed, and then an idea came out of the side of the sky. The kill vanished. The rules had changed before anyone at Rabaul had learned their new name.